Coming up, an official from FEMA discusses extreme weather events affecting tribal nations. We meet the Iñupiaq woman using data to fight for missing and murdered Alaska Natives. And Nick Tilsen gives us an update on Leonard Peltier. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amirawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start today in Oklahoma, where the legislature has again stepped in amid hostility between Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt and the tribes in the state. Last week, Oklahoma lawmakers curbed Stitt's power over the state's Advisory Council on Indian Education. Previously, the governor would appoint half of the members. Now, Stitt only has the authority to appoint one member. The remaining 8 seats would be filled by both chambers of the state's legislature with input from tribal leaders. Stitt described the Advisory Council as an unnecessary government function. That's despite tribal leaders expressing how important it is to meet the needs for 150,000 Native American students in K through 12. For most of Stitt's tenure, up to 8 of the member appointments were left open. Well, the Army has recently partnered with a tribal nation to honor Native remains. A headstone has been created in partnership with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Tribal Historical Office and Fort Campbell. The marker was placed on the grave of 50 partial remains of Native Americans that are buried near the German POW cemetery at the fort. The stone, written both in Cherokee and English, is likely the only marker of its type written in an Indigenous script. The fort has been working with tribes to repatriate remains that have been kept within its museum and provide proper burials to those it has been unable to repatriate. This act has been met with positive reactions from natives based in the fort, including Cherokee Nation citizen and Fort Campbell Garrison Commander Colonel Andrew Jordan, who commended the symbolic marker. We turn now to Minnesota, where a small piece of land is on its way back slowly to Native stewardship. Lawmakers voted this year to return Upper Sioux Agency State Park to the Dakota Upper Sioux community. The 2-square-mile park on traditional Dakota territory is home to ancestral burial grounds. It also houses ruins where soldiers withheld supplies from and starved Dakota people. That helped set the stage for 1862's Dakota War that ended in the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. The transfer isn't expected until 2033. A report on the process is due to the legislature in January. Minnesota has reportedly never before transferred a state park to a Native community. A new study found that more than 1 million acres of Indigenous land has been flooded by dams. The actual amount of land loss is likely higher due to the limited amount of available data. Researchers at Penn State found that the area of flooded land is larger than the size of Rhode Island. Land displacement was a method used to strip land from Indigenous communities, including when families were uprooted from their homes. This study begins to calculate the amount of lost acres due to federal dam construction, in which tribal communities were rarely consulted beforehand. Heather Randall, the assistant professor of rural sociology and demography at Penn State University, said that in light of recent legislation to address aging infrastructure in the U.S. and safety risks caused by climate change, quote, dams that impact tribal land should be prioritized for removal. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. From coast to coast, major weather events are happening more often. As we've seen recently, some can be life-threatening, like hurricanes, heat waves, and droughts. All of this means that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has been very busy. Joining us today from FEMA is Kelbie Kennedy, who is a National Tribal Affairs Advocate. She is the direct point of contact between the agency and tribal nations.
Halito, Aaliyah, thanks so much for having me back.
We have to start today, of course, in Florida with Hurricane Idalia. There, of course, are two federally recognized tribes there, the Seminole and the Miccosukee, plus, of course, the lots of urban Native people who live in the area. What are you hearing about how those communities fared?
So the hurricane is actually going through not just Florida, but also the entirety of FEMA Region 4. So we've been in contact with all of the tribal nations within the path of the hurricane, including those in Florida and outside of Florida. What we're hearing so far from tribal nations overall is that there are no major impacts. We haven't received any notifications from tribal nations of major impacts or immediate needs, but we're making sure to keep in contact with tribal nations' emergency management teams and leadership. One thing, Aaliyah, I want to highlight in particular, I think it's something that speaks to a common theme across Indian country. The Miccosukee tribe in particular has offered to the state government to help with search and rescue teams, with water rescue teams, and we just see that all across Indian country. Even when tribal nations aren't hit by a disaster, they step up to help their neighbors and also fellow tribal citizens who may be in urban areas as well.
We know that on Monday, ahead of the hurricane, President Biden signed a disaster declaration in another state for the Burns Paiute tribe. Tell us about those efforts.
So the Burns Paiute incident happened back in June. They were having many storms, landslides, mudslides that impacted their tribal facilities. And so the disaster declaration process takes what's a little bit of time, and it also takes steps like a preliminary damage assessment. So our FEMA Region 10 team has been working with the tribal nation, making sure to get all the documents in order. And we were really happy to see President Biden issue the major disaster declaration directly for the nations just a few days ago.
Let's jump over to Maui, where, of course, the communities there are recovering from the devastating wildfires in Lahaina. What has FEMA been doing to help the Native Hawaiian people there?
So just as you said, Aaliyah, the wildfires in Maui were absolutely devastating. Currently, we're in the recovery phase. We have a Pacific office that is located within Hawaii that was already staffed, but we've sent additional FEMA staff out to Hawaii. We're currently working with all of our sister agencies, including the Department of the Interior. We have an internal task force that was set up in order to help us address cultural issues. We really have to move at the speed of trust. We need to continue working and doing outreach to the Native Hawaiian community and Native Hawaiian organizations. And so we're, again, trying to work in a way that respects the needs of the Native Hawaiian community to help them recover. It's going to take a while, but FEMA is going to be here as long as it takes to help the community.
We know that, of course, August was just a really busy time for extreme weather. We saw the tropical storm Hillary in Southern California. Were you hearing any reports from tribal nations that were impacted, say, by flooding or other effects of the tropical storm?
Yes, so the impacts of this tropical storm are still being reported by tribal nations. We've had nations that have reported that the storm has impacted roadways and other infrastructure. Our FEMA teams out in FEMA Region 9 are continuing to be in contact with those nations, along in conjunction with our sister agencies, to make sure that we're capturing the damages that those tribal nations need to report in order to be considered for not just a direct disaster declaration, but other assistance that FEMA can help.
As I mentioned before, we know that extreme weather events seem to be happening so much more often, and we know that experts say some of this is linked to climate change. What can tribal leaders do to be proactive ahead of projected storms in the future?
So the biggest thing tribal leaders can do today, I would say, is really focus on building emergency management in blue sky days. Every single tribal nation was hit by COVID-19, and all tribal leaders had to suddenly realize, if they hadn't already, that the worst time to figure out how to go through disaster declarations and emergency management rules and regulations is when a disaster happens. So the more that tribal nations can really support their emergency management internally, hire that emergency manager, build that emergency management department, the better off they'll be. In addition to that, doing trainings and exercises. So for example, we have in 2024, we're going to have our 9th annual Tribal Nations Training Week at the Center for Domestic Preparedness. That'll be March 9th through 16th. That's a free opportunity. Any tribal nation that wants to send staff, it doesn't have to be, your emergency manager. It can be your communication staff, it can be your grant staff, it can be your healthcare staff to this training. It's a free opportunity, and FEMA pays for everything up front. So really want to stress for tribal nations, again, focus on those blue sky days, going through preparedness, and you also get to know your FEMA regional tribal liaisons and FEMA TIFIT teams. FEMA's built out into 10 regions, and we have fantastic tribal staff in each of the regions who will work with your staff to help develop, emergency operation plans, mitigation plans, really help your tribal nation in whatever way that you want to build your emergency management capacity, get the resources and the training you need to be effective. So by the time a disaster actually hits, like you mentioned, Aaliyah, because of climate change, you're going to have everything ready. And FEMA will make sure that we're living up to that treaty and trust responsibility to all tribal nations.
As I mentioned earlier, you are the National Tribal Affairs Advocate at FEMA, which means that you're a political appointee. Do you know if there are any plans post this Biden administration to make this a civil servant position and therefore would make it a little bit more permanent?
So as you mentioned, Aaliyah, the National Tribal Affairs Advocate is a political appointment, and super excited to have Administrator Criswell focus on creating this position. Tribal leaders have asked for a political appointee position. We do have a career position, a National Tribal Affairs Advisor that has been within FEMA for several years. We just brought on my colleague Jay LaPlante, who took on that mantle. But as of right now, if tribal nations want to continue having that elevated level of access to the administrator and a larger voice for Indian country, be vocal. If my role as advocate, and not Kelbie Kennedy, but the role of having a political appointee for tribal nations is something that tribes want to have continued in future administrations. We've gotten feedback from some tribes saying they definitely want it codified in the future. And would love to continue hearing feedback from Indian country, because again, having this elevated position, I can tell you from being inside this agency for 11 months, makes all the difference to make sure that the administrator gets the right information immediately about impacts to tribal nations in Indian country.
Well, FEMA National Tribal Affairs Advocate Kelbie Kennedy, thank you so much for your time today.
Yakuke, thank you.
Alaska public safety officials recently released their first report tracking missing and murdered Native Alaskans. But it wasn't the first such report in the state. Indigenous leaders compiled their own database a couple of years ago. Charlene Apok was part of that effort. ICT's Stewart Huntington asked about the long road that got her state to where it is today.
Ubanga Charlene Apok Iñupiaq Siska Akpik Chinik Mugurunga Suli Nachivik Mugurunga Akaga Sandra Babylu Apok Ihnaga Evan Luklan Savaktunga Data for Indigenous Justice Me. So the translation is, my name is Charlene
Apok has been working for years on the front lines of MMIP issues in Alaska. I asked her about the early years of the work.
Yeah, so this is a wonderful story. I'm glad that you asked. So years ago at the Alaska Federation of Natives, community organizers really wanted to call attention to this issue and hold a rally and read the names of loved ones, only to find that there was no data and it wasn't being tracked and it couldn't be pulled. And so our families and our communities came forward and started sharing the names of their loved ones. And that became the first database. That became the first, we wrote it down and we kept track of it, and we heard those stories, and we heard that it was happening across the state and so many times over time. And so that began really the heart work of the database being tracked here in Alaska. And then that was picked up and carried forward through Data for Indigenous Justice. And that was really hard to do because 4 boxes of race and ethnicity often don't capture who we are. It wasn't being tracked in case classification and so many other, we could go line by line, but it was very hard to track, and it wasn't public available information. And so it's been a long road to get here.
Were the public safety folks interested in accessing your data?
No. So one thing that's unique about Data for Indigenous Justice is we really operate off of having data sovereignty. And so that means, it partially means that tribal people and Indigenous people are collecting information about themselves, for themselves, and for the benefit of themselves, and leading that change to improve, the communities and the families' lives and well-being. And so our data is not for giving back to law enforcement. They should and have data that's accessible to them that they can improve collection upon. But our purpose is first and foremost for Indigenous peoples and tribal people to have information so they can self-determine change on this issue.
And you have people who work with families.
Yeah, so Data for Indigenous Justice is just one of other organizations. That's one of the strengths of something really exciting happening here in Alaska is we have really strong partnerships. And so we work with other folks, Alaska Native Heritage Center, the Justice Center, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and Native Movement. We all partner together every single week to work on this issue. And some of the organizations do provide direct services. So we're able to, hand over in a good way when families come to us wondering what they can do. There are services provided that we can refer them to. DIJ, of course, focuses on the data and having informed decision making and providing the information needed for advocacy. So when we released our report 2 years ago, in 2021, that was the first Alaska-specific MMIW report. So 2 years ago, there was a report released already on this issue by DIJ, and that has since been used to draft legislation to have city recognition bills and things like that. The governor's recognition bill also cited the figure from the report that we put out 2 years ago.
Having someone to work with the families is so important. Confronting silence from officials can be a rough road.
Right. And so that's where, again, I think data speaks so much, right? So there have unfortunately been families who have been experiencing this for over decades, over time. And often it felt like they were just one family, one person trying to keep asking. And so when we come together and we have reports like this, and the one that we did at DIJ, we can see that this sadly has been happening over decades of time across the state, but that also means that families aren't alone, right? And then we can come together and start creating solutions and advocating together. So while these reports are really kind of, you take your breath away when you see that there's hundreds of missing Indigenous peoples for that, this new report points to that. We should be able to look at that and say, wow, this is a real issue and it's been happening over decades of time. Something needs to change.
Charlene, do you think we're at a moment of change? Do you have hope for the coming months and years?
Yeah, I do. So it's doing this work day in and day out is it's really hard, but I'm inspired by families who have been doing this for so long for their loved ones, and that really we're just trying to be the wind beneath their wings and push the systemic issues and make sure that we have this moment in time to create real change. Sometimes it feels like we have so much more to do, which is very true. This is just the beginning, but I'm also very proud of how much has been done so far.
Charlene, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Leonard Peltier has been in federal prison for nearly 49 years, and many groups, including the Indian Collective, are pushing the White House for his release. ICT's Mark Trahant talks to the organization's president and CEO, Nick Tilsen, about the latest effort.
Nick, welcome. There have been several attempts to have Leonard Peltier's prison term reduced. What's the situation now?
So yeah, we're here. Leonard Peltier has been incarcerated for 48 years, going on 49. He's the longest living Indigenous political prisoner in the history of the United States. And so, yet we're in the time of an administration, in the Biden administration, that has been a champion for Indigenous people's rights and Indian country, and have made Indigenous civil rights in this country a priority for this administration. Yet we're still here with Leonard Peltier still incarcerated. And so the latest efforts over the past few years have been to press hard and to educate a new generation of people about this case, because it's been going on so long. Some people don't know about it. I mean, one of the biggest stories and people have to understand is they have to understand what was happening in that period of history, what was happening at that time. The American Indian movement was started in 1968 on the streets of Minneapolis, and between 1968 and 1976, the American Indian movement and grassroots indigenous people throughout Indian country, there was an uprising of folks reclaiming identity, reclaiming land, reclaiming power. Took over the BIA headquarters. Some of the demands that were in there are still relevant to this day. But what happened at that time is the United States government decided and made the decision to attack the American Indian movement, and they engaged in a counterintelligence strategy to try to pacify the American Indian movement. So at one given time, almost every one of the leaders in the American Indian movement was incarcerated, was jailed, was facing charges. The movement became heavily infiltrated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And in the atmosphere after Wounded Knee in 1973, all the way into the shootout in 1975, that period of time was considered the reign of terror on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is my home community. I live in Porcupine, and about 3.5 miles from where Wounded Knee is. And at that time in history, you had the goons or the guardians of the Oglala Nation who were heavily funded by the United States government. And the United States has done this in countries all around the world. They did it right here too, with its paramilitary forces. And so it was in this climate where there was FBI, US Marshals, paramilitary folks, heavily funded and supported. And actually in the days leading up to the shootout at Oglala, they had made all these false narratives. And so what happened on that day is that they came in there with the intention to take down that camp. And within not only the two agents, but within minutes, people in that camp are taking gunfire from agents all around. And on that day, 2 agents were killed, Kohler and Williams, and there was a third person killed, Joe Stuntz, who was a Native American person whose his murder and his killing was never investigated at all. And that tells everything about this. The UN even recently, came to the conclusion that the only reason why Leonard Peltier is still in prison is because he's Native American. The FBI and every single FBI agent swears an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. But several times throughout this entire proceedings and this entire criminalization of Leonard Peltier, they have engaged in constitutional violations, in prosecutorial misconduct, and fabrication of evidence. So they've created so many false narratives and so many false lies, it's hard for them to go back on. And remember, in the days after the shootout, this became the biggest manhunt in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And it's time for this administration and it's time for folks in the positions of power to release him. In comparison, Nelson Mandela sat in prison for 27 years. He sat in prison for 27 years because of his political beliefs, because of the things he was fighting for to abolish apartheid in South Africa, because of the revolutionary things that he was trying to change. And here you have Leonard Peltier, who's been sitting in there 48 years, going on 49 years. And I share that just to put things into comparison of the depth of this injustice. Leonard is, Leonard's elderly now. Leonard is an elder. We're coming up on his birthday. His health has been struggling for years. And he's frustrated. I mean, he's frustrated He's very, very frustrated, but he's holding out to be strong. He like some of the stuff that he has said is, I don't have much time. Like, I don't have much time left. What he meant was, I don't have much time on this earth left. And he wants to know people are fighting for him. And he gets very frustrated too, because he's isolated from his people, from his community. And so there's a lot of emotions that he has at this time, mixed with the health concerns. I mean, why do you have an elder at Coleman in a maximum security prison? And he, of course, like, he's a fighter though too, like he's a warrior. And so even though he's struggling, he's still fighting on to make sure that he makes it all the way to his potential release. And so I think that's where, when we mobilize for Leonard, when we organize for Leonard, when we voice our when we speak the truth to power, when we're being light to this struggle, it helps him keep fighting. It helps him to show that people on the outside have not forgotten about him, and it keeps him motivated to keep fighting every single day.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.